My name is Evelyn Trask. After 12 loyal years, I was blindsided, fired by a younger CEO in a glass-walled room where no one looked me in the eye. They called it just numbers, but it felt like betrayal. I walked out with nothing but dignity and made the boldest choice of my life. I refused to stay silent. If you've ever been pushed aside and told to smile through it, listen to my story. Then tell me, did I do the right thing by walking away? Or should I have fought a different way? I'm still wondering. I still remember that Tuesday. The sky didn't look any different. Flat, pale blue like a blank piece of paper. But something in me knew. I felt at the moment I stepped through the revolving door of the 14th floor. The kind of knowing that lives in your bones before it makes its way into your thoughts. It was quiet in the office. Quieter than usual. Not the peaceful kind, though. This was the quiet of withheld glances, of people murmuring near coffee machines and silencing their voices when you walked by. The kind of quiet that leaves your palms clammy even if the air is still. I walked past the front desk with a polite nod, headed straight to the break room, pretending everything was fine. I reached for the cappuccino machine like I always did. Same cup, same button, same routine. But that morning, the machine made a sound I'd never heard before, an ugly, screeching hiss, as if even it had something to say. I stood there, waiting for the foam to settle, watching the milk spin like it could give me a sign. I felt like I didn't belong to the place anymore, even though my name was still on the directory and my badge still let me in. Belridge Group had been my second skin for almost 12 years. Denver winters came and went through that glass, and I weathered them all from this very office. I helped build the client relations division from the ground up. I stayed late. I traveled. I kept things human when the company started chasing quarterly targets like a dog after its tail. But lately, something had shifted. Strathwell Capital had completed the merger just 2 months ago. They sent over their people. Young, polished, sharp-edged. One of them was Delia Vaughan, the new CEO. A woman who dressed like she meant war and smiled like she was reading from a script. She had that kind of presence you couldn't ignore, but you didn't want to get too close either. Delia always wore this perfume, cold, expensive, and distant. The kind of scent that warned you before her words ever did. At 10:06 a.m., a notification pinged on my phone. Can you come up to the executive conference room at 10:30? Delia would like a quick chat. It was from Allison, her executive assistant. No subject line. No pleasantries. Just business. I stared at the screen longer than I should have. My thumb hovered over the reply button before I finally typed back. Sure. I knew it before I even stood up. By 10:28, I was outside the conference room. My heels clicked against the floor in that stiff, echoing hallway. I straightened my blazer, instinct more than pride, and walked in without knocking. She was already seated, a sleek silver laptop open in front of her, not a single paper out of place. Evelyn, she said, nodding once. Her tone was clean, efficient, almost automated. Thanks for coming up. I nodded in return but didn't sit. Something about her posture told me I wouldn't be staying long. I'll get to the point, she said, folding her hands together. We've completed our initial audit post-merger. Strathwell has certain structural expectations, particularly around compensation alignment. Unfortunately, your role doesn't align with those expectations. I didn't speak. Delia went on. We're restructuring compensation to reflect Strathwell's efficiency goals. Your salary places you outside the optimized range. Effective today, your position is being eliminated. Just like that. No mention of the clients I brought in. No talk of the years I steadied this company through acquisitions and personnel turnover. No recognition of the fact that my team generated nearly half the firm's recurring revenue. Nothing. Just numbers. I stared at her for a moment. She didn't flinch. I could have said a lot. Could have reminded her that half the contacts in our CRM had my name on them. That the loyalty we claimed to offer clients was built on human connections, not margins. But I didn't. I stood there with the kind of silence that says, I hear you. I just don't accept it. This isn't personal, Evelyn. It's just numbers, she said, as if that line came printed in some executive manual. Of course it wasn't personal to her. That's what made it so personal to me. I nodded once. Just once. Then I turned and walked out, my heels sounding louder than they did walking in. The elevator ride felt like a slow fall. Back at my desk, I found a cardboard box already there. Neatly folded, new. Not even a crease in the side. Someone had prepared it ahead of time. That small, stupid detail almost made me laugh. I packed in silence. No one came to say anything. Not one goodbye. Except for Eli from accounting, barely out of college. He looked up from his monitor, stood halfway, and gave me a quiet nod. A thank you, or maybe an apology, he couldn't say out loud. I didn't cry. I didn't fume. But inside, something cracked. And as I walked out of Belridge Group for the last time, the sun still shone on the windows like any other day. But I knew. I didn't know who gave the order. But I knew exactly who I would never stay silent for again. The elevator let out a soft ding when it hit the ground floor, and the doors opened like nothing had happened. I stepped out with a cardboard box in my hands, full of things that used to mean something. A framed photo of my team from our best quarter, a half-used bottle of Advil, a coffee mug with a chip on the handle. The sun was out, but it wasn't warm. I remember thinking that. It was the kind of light that makes the sidewalk brighter, but doesn't touch your skin. My hands felt colder than they should have, even with the box weighing them down. I didn't want to go home, not yet. I needed somewhere familiar that didn't have glass walls and executive chairs and fake smiles. So I walked to Ashwood Cafe. It wasn't far, just a few blocks from the office. I used to meet clients there all the time. It had these deep red booths and dim lighting that made you feel like time slowed down just enough to let you breathe. I sat in the corner booth like I always did. The waitress, Samantha, I think, recognized me and brought over my usual without asking. Cappuccino, no sugar. But that day, I barely touched it. The foam collapsed while I stared at the window, watching people pass by like nothing had shifted in their world. I sat there trying to figure out what hurt most. Not the loss of the job. I'd survive that. Not even the money, though I'd be lying if I said it wasn't on my mind. What hurt was how easily I was erased. 12 years of loyalty. Of defending Belridge when clients got frustrated. Of showing up early for the meetings no one else wanted. Of building trust one call, one lunch, one crisis at a time. And all of it tossed aside like it didn't carry weight. Like I didn't carry weight. I thought about that quarterback in 2019. One of our biggest clients, Blackmar Group, was ready to walk. Delia wasn't there then. We were in the middle of a contract dispute, and legal was already preparing for damage control. But I called Henry Blackmar myself. I met him in this very booth. I listened. I took notes. I asked him what he needed that he wasn't getting. We kept that account. They renewed for 3 more years. That's when I started believing that doing things the right way, treating people like people, would always protect you. That if you were decent and honest and kept your head down, the world would make room for you. But apparently, someone forgot to tell Delia Vorn. I looked around the cafe, and I didn't see anyone I needed to smile for. No clients, no colleagues, no brand to represent. Just me. And a very quiet question building in my chest. What now? My phone buzzed. I almost didn't check it. I wasn't in the mood for sympathy or small talk. But the name that popped up surprised me. Thomas Verrill. We'd gone to the same business school back in Chicago. Lost touch after that, though I remembered seeing his name now and then on LinkedIn. He'd worked for a big agency in D.C., then something smaller in Portland. Last I heard, he'd started his own consultancy. The message was short. Heard what happened. I'm in Denver this weekend. Ashwood Cafe on Sunday. I stared at the screen for a while before replying. Sure. Noon. I didn't know exactly what he wanted, but I knew I didn't want to be alone. Not for another hour. Not on another Sunday morning that felt like every door had just slammed shut. When Sunday came, Thomas looked older, grayer, rounder around the face, but his smile hadn't changed. We shook hands, and he slid into the booth across from me like no time had passed. After some small talk, he cut straight to it. They did you dirty, he said, matter of fact. I nodded. It's business, right? I tried to sound unaffected, but it came out thin. Yeah, that's what they say when they want you to stay quiet. We sat in silence for a moment, both of us staring at the scratches on the tabletop. I got pushed out at 45, he said. Company I helped triple in revenue. Said I was resistant to digital culture. Translation: too old to mold. I looked up. How long did it take before you didn't feel bitter? Thomas sipped his coffee. Still working on it some days. But bitterness is like a house with no windows. At some point, you forget what light feels like. I let that settle in. You've always built bridges, Evelyn, he said quietly. But tell me this, are you still on one or are you under it? I didn't answer. I wasn't sure yet. It was the following Tuesday, exactly a week since I'd carried my box of belongings out the glass doors of Belridge Group. I was halfway through sweeping the porch when my phone buzzed. I ignored it the first time. The second time, it buzzed again, persistent, like a knock you can't pretend you don't hear. It was a text from Allie Jennings, middle manager. Smart, sharp, always 2 steps ahead of her age. She'd only been with Belridge for a year, but she caught on quick. I mentored her a little, nothing formal, just conversations by the copy machine or late-night emails about pitch strategies. I never expected to hear from her again. The message read, I just heard what they did. This is madness. No emojis. No soft landings. Just outrage typed into a small glowing screen. I stared at it for a second, unsure how to respond. Before I could type anything back, an email pinged. This one hit harder. The subject line was blank, but the sender was unmistakable. Garrison Moore Logistics. We're reconsidering our renewal. Can we talk? I sat down slowly on the arm of the porch chair. The air around me shifted. Not a breeze. Just the strange weight of realization pressing on my shoulders. I hadn't reached out to anyone. Not a single client. I knew my non-compete clause, and more than that, I knew what integrity looked like. But apparently, my silence hadn't gone unnoticed. That night, I brewed a cup of tea and sat by the window, scrolling through a slow wave of pings, LinkedIn messages, a few missed calls from unfamiliar numbers, one voicemail from an old contact at Dalehurst Holdings who said, I just wanted to check in. We heard what happened. It doesn't sit right with us. I didn't know what to feel. I hadn't asked for any of this. But somewhere inside, a small corner of me stood up straighter. The next day, Allie sent another message. Morale's a mess. No one knows who's safe anymore. Finance and marketing are blaming each other for the client drop-offs. Delia's barely been seen since Friday. People are nervous. I typed back, I'm sorry to hear that. You doing okay? She replied, trying to stay above water. But it feels like something's coming loose from the inside. It made sense. Loyalty, like trust, doesn't disappear overnight, but it does erode when no one's holding the foundation steady. By Friday, rumors had started circulating. A former colleague forwarded me a screenshot from an internal memo. Delia had apparently told the exec team I was unwilling to adapt to the new compensation philosophy and had demanded a salary package significantly above her scope. That last part made me laugh. Not because it was funny, but because it was so transparent. So deeply, clumsily defensive. I hadn't demanded anything. In fact, I hadn't even negotiated. I was told I didn't fit the new structure. Period. No conversation. No options. Just a door. I showed the memo to Thomas over lunch that weekend. He read it without speaking, then slid the phone back to me. Let the storm speak for itself, he said. You've planted deeper roots than she ever will. I looked at him. Do you really think this is going to collapse? He shrugged, but it wasn't an empty gesture. Maybe not all at once. But when a company starts trimming the branches that carry fruit, they don't realize the tree's starving until it's too late. I didn't say much after that, but something settled in my chest, like gravel finding the bottom of a glass jar. A quiet kind of clarity. I hadn't caused the unraveling, but I could feel it happening. Later that night, I went back to Ashwood. The cafe was quieter than usual. I sat at the same booth. Same cappuccino. This time, though, it didn't go cold. I watched a couple in the corner booth talk business. Open laptops, messy notes, tired eyes. Probably building something from scratch.
Probably scared.
Probably hopeful. That's when I realized I wasn't grieving Belridge anymore. I was grieving the belief that being good at your job, staying loyal, and working with integrity was some kind of shield. It wasn't. But it also wasn't useless. Because people were still reaching out. Because not everyone stayed quiet. And maybe that meant the story wasn't over. Maybe it was just slipping into a different chapter. It had been years since I'd stepped foot in the Church of Greenwood. Not because I stopped believing, but because work had a way of stretching itself into Sundays. There was always another email to respond to, a proposal to polish, or a meeting to prep for Monday. Worship became something I told myself I'd get to when things settled down. Now, with nothing left to schedule around, I walked in quietly that morning. The old wooden pews, the sun filtering through stained glass, the warm voices singing something familiar. It all made me feel like I'd opened a door to a version of myself I'd almost forgotten. The version who used to breathe deeper, who used to sit still without thinking about her to-do list. I sat near the back, not to hide, but to observe. Let the words soak in. There was a line in the sermon that stayed with me long after the choir had finished. Sometimes, the loss we fear the most is the one that frees us. I didn't cry, but something softened in me. The kind of soft that comes when you realize you've been carrying a weight for so long, you forgot it wasn't a part of your body. After the service, I moved toward the door with the crowd, keeping my head down. I wasn't expecting conversation, just a clean exit and maybe a quiet coffee afterward. Evelyn. I turned. Mason Dale, CEO of Dalehust Holdings. One of my longest-standing clients back at Belridge. I hadn't seen him since last spring, our last quarterly review over turkey sandwiches in a rented conference room. I remembered he liked his coffee black and his numbers sharper than most accountants. He looked surprised but genuine. I wasn't sure it was you. I heard, well, I wasn't sure if it was true. It was, I said simply. He nodded, then motioned toward the door. You have time for a cup of coffee? I hesitated for half a second, then nodded.
Yeah.
I do. We ended up at Ashwood Cafe, my usual booth. The one by the corner window, where the light hits just right, no matter what time of day it is. Mason didn't beat around the bush. After a few pleasantries, he leaned forward. If you ever consider starting something of your own, he said, we'd love to be your first client. The spoon I'd been stirring my drink with froze for a beat. You're serious? I asked, trying to keep my voice even.
Completely, he said.
Our team was rattled by the news. We always felt we were working with you, not the firm. I sat back. The words hung there, heavier than they sounded. I hadn't let my mind go that far yet. Starting something of my own? That always felt like a young person's game. Risk belonged to the bold, the hungry, the sleepless. Not the woman who made sure her fridge was stocked and her 401k was on track. But his words planted something. Not a plan, not yet, but a possibility. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The offer. The opening.
The shift.
I paced my living room longer than I cared to admit. I kept hearing Delia's voice in my head. This isn't personal. It's just numbers. And then, that lie they floated around about me asking for more than I was worth. At 56, the job market doesn't exactly hold the door open for you. You're either seen as too slow to keep up or too expensive to keep on. And the fear of confirming every stereotype, difficult, outdated, bitter, had always kept me in line. I used to believe that if I kept my head down, did my job right, and kept the peace, no one would ever question my value. But I was wrong. Playing nice didn't protect me. It just made me easier to overlook. I realized then, I wasn't afraid anymore. I had nothing left to prove to anyone who measured me in dollars or slides on a PowerPoint deck. What I had was what I'd built: relationships, trust, credibility. And those things weren't tied to anyone else's payroll. I opened my laptop for the first time since that last meeting in the conference room. The screen glowed like a stage light. Blank. Waiting. I opened a new document and typed the file name slowly. Langley_Strategic_Proposal Docs. I wrote the first draft of my business plan in pajama pants, with a chipped mug of lukewarm coffee by my elbow and a legal pad covered in scribbles beside my laptop. The kitchen table was covered in notes, highlighters, and sticky tabs. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't impressive. But it was mine. Langley Strategic Partners didn't begin with funding or press releases. It started with one idea, that relationships built on trust could outlast any company logo. I didn't need fancy branding or investor hype. I needed space to think clearly and enough clients who believed in the same thing. Mason Dale was the first. True to his word, he brought his team to our first meeting at a rented office suite near Spear Boulevard. The space smelled like old carpet and stale air conditioning, and the whiteboard was permanently stained with someone else's agenda. But Mason didn't care. Neither did I. That first week, we laid out a 6-month roadmap. No one said the word disruption or threw around acronyms like they were currency.
We talked about goals. We talked about people.
And slowly, other calls started coming in, quiet, curious, respectful. Dale Hust Holdings joined. Then a regional distributor from Phoenix I hadn't heard from in 3 years. By the end of the first month, I had 4 clients on retainer and enough recurring revenue to cover expenses for the next quarter. I didn't post anything online. I didn't take potshots at Belridge. I didn't need to. The people who wanted to work with me already knew where to find me. Then one morning, Thomas and I met for breakfast, scrambled eggs, rye toast, and the same diner we used to stop at during conferences back in Chicago. You know, he said between bites, I've had 3 different people ask me if you're taking on investors. I nearly dropped my fork. Seriously? Dead serious. One of them's a friend of mine from Richmond. Venture capital guy. He saw your name mentioned in a client forum. Wants to throw money your way. I raised an eyebrow. And what strings come with that? He smiled. You know better than I do. Growth targets. Exit strategies. PowerPoint decks until your eyeballs dry out. I laughed, but it was the kind that came from knowing exactly what he meant. I'm not ready to scale, I said. Not like that. Not if it means handing over the steering wheel. Thomas nodded. Good. Because your quiet is louder than most people's noise. That stuck with me. Meanwhile, back at Belridge, the dominoes were starting to fall. Clients began pulling back. Some didn't renew. Others asked to renegotiate terms, and not because the economy had changed. Word got around that certain teams were asking, not so subtly, whether I'd be returning. Delia, from what I heard, avoided those questions. But avoidance doesn't cancel impact. One Thursday morning, Allie forwarded me an internal summary from a Belridge staff meeting. Delia had addressed the drop in client retention and claimed the issue stemmed from an overdependence on outdated personal relationships, which no longer align with our scalable engagement model. I read it twice. Outdated. Personal relationships. I stared at the screen and smiled, not with spite, but with a kind of quiet vindication. You could dress it up in strategy talk, but people knew what mattered. And no matter how many new dashboards you installed, no metric could fake sincerity. I didn't reply to Allie. I didn't need to. Instead, I closed my laptop, stepped out onto the porch, and let the fall air fill my lungs. There was nothing loud about the moment. No cheering, no headlines, no flash of victory. Just a breeze. Just peace. And the sense that I wasn't chasing validation anymore. I had built something that didn't need permission. And that file, Langley_strategic_proposal.docs, wasn't just a plan anymore. It was a beginning. The call came in on a Thursday afternoon, just as I was closing my laptop after a long virtual check-in with a client in Minneapolis. I had half a sandwich still sitting on the plate beside me, untouched, and a headache crawling across the back of my neck. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, just a Denver area code, no name, no hint. I let it go to voicemail. But 30 seconds later, I played it anyway. Maybe it was curiosity. Or maybe it was the kind of instinct that forms after decades in business, the one that lets you smell tension before it walks through the door. Allison here. The voice began, calm, professional, too polite. I'm calling on behalf of Delia Vorn. She'd like to schedule a meeting with you in person. Tomorrow morning, 9 a.m., at the Belridge office, if possible. There was no explanation. No outline. Just the suggestion of civility dressed up as opportunity. I didn't respond right away. I just sat there, staring at the wall behind my laptop, the faint hum of the refrigerator in the background suddenly too loud. Thomas called 20 minutes later, like he always seemed to when the air in my chest started to tighten. "She wants a meeting," he said after I told him. "In person. At Belridge." He was quiet for a second. Then, "You gonna go?" I rubbed my temple. "I think I have to. But I'm not walking in there alone. I'll meet you at 8:45. And he did, right on time. The next morning, we walked through the glass front doors together, just like we used to walk into hotel lobbies before client summits. This time, though, the walls were colder. Or maybe I was just more awake. The young woman at reception didn't recognize me. She smiled the way receptionists are trained to, warm, efficient, a little distant. But when she handed me the visitor badge, I noticed the scanner still beeped with my name in the system. Evelyn Trask. Active profile. I guess some systems take longer to forget than others. We were led upstairs by a silent assistant in 2 high heels to the same executive conference room where I'd been dismissed months ago. Same frosted glass. Same chrome handles. Same light gray table. Wide, sterile, and still faintly smelling of stale lemon wipes. But this time, I wasn't there to defend my place. I already had won. Delia walked in at 9:03. Punctual, but never early. Her signature black suit was immaculate. She wore pearl studs and her usual precision smooth hair. No hint of strain on her face, but her eyes gave something away, fatigue, maybe. Or calculation. "Evelyn," she said with a measured smile.
Thomas.
"Thank you for coming." I nodded. "Morning." She took her seat across from us, setting down a leather folder. No laptop. No slides. A choice, I noted. Make it feel personal. Relational. Like this wasn't business. "There's an opportunity I'd like to discuss," she began. "Given the shifts in the market and the response your firm has generated, it seems there may be room for collaboration." Thomas sat back, crossed one leg over the other, and said nothing. His silence gave me space to speak. "Are we talking synergy?" I asked. "Or a buyout?" Delia didn't flinch. "A strategic alignment. Langley Strategic would fold into the Belridge structure, retaining a measure of operational independence. You'd lead client strategy under a new title, negotiable. Equity could be discussed." I kept my eyes on her. "Under Strathwell Capital?" "Yes," she answered, smooth and automatic. I let that sit. Then I leaned in just slightly. "Is this a rescue or a recruitment?" She paused. It wasn't long. A second, maybe 2. But it was long enough. "This is an opportunity," she said, lowering her voice just slightly, "to create something stronger together. You've built remarkable momentum. And we—" "I walked out of this room with nothing," I said, cutting gently across her sentence. "And somehow, I found more than I ever had in it." The air in the room shifted. Not dramatically. There was no gasp, no flinch. But something cooled. The performance cracked just a little. Delia closed her folder slowly, fingers deliberate. "I respect what you've done," she said at last. "It's not easy to rebuild from the outside." "It's not supposed to be," I said. "But it is possible." Thomas leaned forward and pushed back from the table, his signal that we were done. Delia looked like she wanted to say more. Maybe to reframe the offer, soften the terms. Maybe just to win. But she didn't. As we stepped out of the room, I gave one last glance at the table, the long stretch of polished wood that had held so many of my efforts, so many of my compromises, so many of my silences. My chair, the one I used to sit in during late-night forecasts and client reviews, was empty. And it could stay that way. Because I wasn't coming back. It didn't take long for the news to travel. Denver's business world was a lot smaller than it pretended to be. Deals moved fast, but gossip moved faster, and my quiet no to Belridge? That was louder than any press release. They said I had declined a strategic partnership, that I walked away from a seat at the table. But it wasn't a seat, it was a leash. Within 2 weeks, 3 major clients pulled their contracts. One shifted to a firm in Austin. The other 2 came to me. I didn't call them. I didn't make a pitch. They reached out one by one, not with spreadsheets or formal inquiries, but with voices that carried something heavier than business. They weren't just choosing a new provider. They were choosing a new standard. I didn't feel triumphant. Not in the way people expect you to feel when power tips in your favor. No fist pumps. No champagne. Just a quiet breath and a quieter thought. Maybe I was right to trust myself. Then the formal language came out of Belridge's boardroom. Delia Vaughan was asked to step back from operational leadership pending internal review. That's how they worded it. Professional.
Vague.
Sterile. Like it was a scheduling conflict, not a reckoning. But I knew what it meant. Her time was cracking. Not because I'd fought back, but because I hadn't played her game. And then, one morning, an email landed in my inbox from the Denver Ethics and Business Association. It had been years since I attended any of their events, back when going felt more like checking a box than finding your voice. This time, they weren't inviting me as a guest. They wanted me to speak. The topic was integrity during organizational transition. I sat there rereading the subject line, coffee cooling beside me, the cursor blinking over an empty reply. I wasn't sure if I had a speech in me, but I knew I had something to say. When the day came, the room was smaller than I remembered. A conference center just off Lincoln Street, nothing fancy. About 60 people, maybe more, local business owners, HR directors, a few tired mid-level folks holding travel mugs and quiet questions. I stood in the back for a while listening to the panel before me. I'd brought a few note cards, but they stayed in my pocket. I wasn't there to teach. I was there to tell the truth. When it was my turn, I stepped up to the podium and looked at the room. Some faces I recognized. Others I didn't. What struck me wasn't who was there, but how still they were. No rustling. No phones. Just eyes waiting. I cleared my throat. I never wanted a war, I said. I only wanted to be seen. And when I wasn't, I left, because that too is a way of speaking. I told them what it felt like to sit in a boardroom and realize your voice had been reduced to a budget line. I told them about silence, not as defeat, but as a decision. I told them about starting over with a laptop, a chipped mug, and a name that still had weight in the right rooms. I didn't name names.
I didn't take jabs.
I didn't have to. The power of the story wasn't in who had wronged me. It was in what I chose to do after. The room didn't clap right away when I finished. They didn't need to. The pause was long. Honest. The kind that says you've just said something we needed to hear. As I stepped down, a few people stopped me. Soft thank yous. A few lingering handshakes. One woman held my hand a beat longer and said, "That was brave." I didn't say it, but part of me wanted to whisper, no, it was overdue. And then I saw her, Rita from compliance. She hadn't changed much. Same sharp eyes behind simple glasses. Same kindness, she always kept quiet in meetings full of posturing. She walked toward me and didn't say a word at first. Just hugged me, brief but real, and said, "Seeing you speak gave me the courage to update my resume." That night, I sat on the porch with a cup of mint tea, watching the leaves scuttle across the sidewalk.
My phone buzzed a few times.
A message from a former Belridge marketing manager. Another from HR. A third from someone I hadn't spoken to since 2016. Each message was different, but the message was the same. You reminded me, I still have a voice. That was the applause. Not the kind you hear with your ears. The kind you feel in the way someone finally looks at themselves in the mirror and chooses to stop flinching. Later, I stepped back inside and picked up my mother's Bible from the shelf. The spine cracked easily to where her fingers had lingered most. Matthew. Let your yes be yes and your no be no. I closed the book gently, set it on the table, and turned off the light. And for the first time in years, I didn't set an alarm. Because peace, the real kind, isn't something you hustle to earn again tomorrow. It stays when you've chosen it. The morning light poured into the kitchen like it had something to say. It washed over the counter, the stack of notebooks, and the worn laptop that had seen more drafts and proposals than I could count. I moved slowly, no rush, no meetings to brace for, no crisis emails waiting. Just the hum of the coffee machine and the stillness of a day that didn't demand anything from me. I poured a cup, sat by the window, and looked at the same table where, months ago, I typed out the first file, Langley_Strategic_Proposal docs. I remembered how my hands shook then, hovering over the keyboard. Back when all I had was one idea and a long list of reasons to doubt it. Now, the office across town bore our name on the door. Small, simple, but steady. Allie arrived around 9:15, balancing 2 to-go cups and a manila folder. She'd left Belridge a few weeks earlier and joined us part-time, marketing and admin support. She didn't make a grand exit. She just walked out one day and didn't go back. She didn't say it directly, but I think hearing me speak that night gave her permission. "You're gonna like this," she said, setting down the folder. We hit our quarterly targets early. I smiled, not wide but deep. That quiet kind of pride that doesn't need to be said out loud. Just after 10, Thomas showed up, paper bag in hand, cinnamon rolls inside, still warm. "You spoil us," I said. He shrugged. "It's either this or I start offering unsolicited strategy advice again." He stayed for coffee, half leaning on the edge of the conference table while Allie pulled up client reports. There was laughter, talk of new inquiries, a mention of someone we might hire by spring. Before he left, Thomas looked around the room. The bookshelves, the whiteboard, the wall of thank you cards from clients. "Your silence," he said, "did more than any lawsuit ever could." I didn't answer. I just nodded because some things don't need a reply. That afternoon, someone forwarded me a piece from Denver Business Weekly. The headline was simple: "Vorn steps down as Belridge leadership faces scrutiny." The article cited board pressure, leadership restructuring, and growing concerns from long-term clients. I read it once, then folded it and slid it into a drawer. I didn't feel vindicated. I didn't feel angry either. Just a kind of peaceful distance, like watching a storm in a city you've already left. Thomas glanced at the headline before it disappeared into the drawer. "I hope she finds something real to build next time," I said. "Maybe she will," he said quietly. A few days later, during our weekly internal huddle, I found myself standing at the head of the table. Not leading like I used to at Belridge, just offering perspective, asking questions, listening more than speaking. We had 5 team members now. Young, sharp kind. They worked hard, but they didn't hide behind titles. They challenged ideas without ego. They said thank you often. I saw versions of myself in them, but better, bolder, freer. Before we wrapped up, I paused. "One last thing," I said. "Here, we don't trade kindness for performance. They go together, or they go away." The room went still. Not in discomfort, but in understanding. That night, I received an email from one of my oldest clients. A brief note, no punctuation except a period at the end. "Thank you for not staying silent." I read it 3 times. Not because I didn't get it, but because I did. Fully. There was a time I believed being quiet was the price for being allowed to stay. That if I just worked hard enough, long enough, politely enough, the world would eventually call that fairness. But it doesn't. Fairness isn't handed out like bonuses. It's something we have to choose to fight for, even when it makes people uncomfortable. Even when it costs us titles, desks, or whole careers. That night, I sat on the edge of my bed, looked out the window, and let my shoulders relax in a way they hadn't in years. I used to think if I stayed quiet and steady, the world would treat me fairly. Now I know. Fairness isn't granted. It's claimed, every day, by the way we choose to live. Before we end this story, I just want to leave you with this. Sometimes the hardest part isn't speaking up, it's believing you have the right to. I didn't always know how to choose myself. It took losing almost everything to realize I still had something no one could take. My voice. Maybe you've been there. Maybe you're there now. If this story touched something in you, if it reminded you of a quiet strength you almost forgot, I hope you'll stay for the next one. I'll be here, and I'd love to hear what part of this story spoke to you most.